querying a database. In our previous lecture, we talked about creating a database, and we created a database named Research Papers. We created the database, we created the tables, we enforced referential data integrity, and we input all of the records. So now we have all of the records input into our Research Papers database, and now we want to view the information or manipulate that information from the database. One way we could do that is by using a query. A query is a request for information from the database. To extract information from your database, you have to use a query, and the query is simply a request or question. Usually you will have a criteria, sometimes you will not. The criteria is an expression that tells the database management system which records you want to retrieve, and the criteria will be made up of conditions. When you run the query, a dynaset or a subset of the database is displayed. You can make changes to this dynaset, and the changes will be reflected in your database because the dynaset is just a view of the database. You can also make changes to the database, and when you rerun your query, it will be reflected in the query itself. Let's do an example here. I want to go on one more before I show you the example in the database. Let's go to the next slide. When you want to create a query in Access, they have a GUI, a graphical user interface for you, that is called the Qbe Grid, or the Query by Example Grid. The Query by Example Grid looks like the slide that you're looking at, the figure to the left, and you input, you put the information in that you want to display, and then a dynaset is created when you run the query. So the Qbe Grid, it's a GUI. You don't have to type in information. All you have to do is drag and drop what you want, and then a dynaset will be created when you run the query. And notice this dynaset just displays the customer first name and last name because that's all I want to display. All the other fields still exist in the database table, but I just want to display these fields. I'm going to do this in the database itself. I'm going to click on Create. You can use Query Wizard or Query Design. The Query Wizard walks you through. We are going to do some more advanced queries, so we will use Query Design. And then you decide the table. And we want to display the first name and the last name. Here's our Qbe Grid. It's a Query by Example Grid. It is a GUI, a graphical user interface that allows you to drag and drop the information that you want or type in information instead of having to learn the programming language on how to interact with your database. Also, if you want the screen bigger, you can just click here and make that bigger. So here it is, my Qbe Grid. When I run the query, up here on the run, the exclamation point, there is a view of my database, and that view is just the first name and last name. Again, all the records and all the information still exist in the database. This is just a dynaset or a subset or a view of the database. I'm going to change John Smith to John Jones. Hit the Enter key. I'm going to close out of here. I'm going to click on Yes. I'm going to give this query and the name of client list because I like to make the query self-describing. You could name it anything you want. I'm going to click OK. Notice now, if I click on the client table, John Jones is now changed, John Smith, his name is now changed to John Jones because I made a change in the query, and remember the query is just a subset, a dynaset, a view of your data. If I go back and change it to Smith here, and I close this table, and I double click on the client list and run it, now the name is displayed again as John Smith because I am displaying a view of my database. Now, when you create this or when you use this Qbe Grid, there is a programming language that is created, that is generated behind the scenes that you don't see. Oh, and by the way, before we continue, this is what you will have to do on paper, and we will talk about this later in our next video. But let's talk about the programming language that is used to talk to the database. This programming language is called Structured Query Language, SQL, or SQL, and it is the language that is used to talk to the database. It is a programming language. Access provides you a GUI to be able for you to interact with the database without having to know the commands. So you use the Qbe Grid. When you use the Qbe Grid and you run the query, Microsoft Access 2010 will create this structured queried language for you behind the scenes. And in our database here, I'm going to close. No, I'm not going to close. I'm going to keep this open. I'm going to click on Home. I'm going to click on View. And I'm going to click on SQL View. And there is the language that is generated from the GUI that you created. Before this GUI was in existence, you would have to learn how to learn the programming language and the syntax of the programming language in order for you to interact with the database. Many times programmers still, we learn this and we still use it, but the GUI is a very nice feature. Many times if I'm trying to learn it, or when I first started learning SQL, I would do queries in Access and then pull up the SQL and look at it and examine it, and that would help quite a bit to learn the language.